A hitman infiltrated the ICU to finish a wounded SEAL. He didn't expect the head nurse to recognize him. The helicopter came in low and fast, blades cutting through the cold Maryland air like something desperate and running out of time. The medics were already moving before the wheels touched the tarmac. They did not slow down. They did not speak to each other beyond the clipped language of people who have done this before and know that every second spent talking is a second stolen from the man on the stretcher. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Holt, 39 years old, was that man on the stretcher. He had 3 rounds in his torso. One had passed clean through. The other 2 had not. His left lung was struggling in a way that made the sounds coming from his chest remind the lead medic of something he never wanted to hear again. His blood pressure was dropping in steady increments, like a clock winding down, and the oxygen levels in his blood were doing something that the numbers on the monitor described but could not quite communicate the full horror of. He was alive. Barely, but alive. The trauma team met the stretcher at the bay doors and took him without ceremony. They cut away what remained of his tactical gear, cataloged his injuries with the speed and precision of people trained to make impossible decisions in under 60 seconds, and moved him into surgery before most of the hospital had finished its first cup of coffee. He had been in Sonora, Mexico, 48 hours earlier. The official report, filed by his Joint Terminal Attack Controller Team and stamped with the kind of classification codes that made civilian administrators look elsewhere, listed the cause of his injuries as enemy fire during a covert reconnaissance operation gone sideways. 3 members of his squad were also wounded. One, a 24-year-old named Petty Officer Second Class Danny Reeves, had come home with a graze across his left shoulder and a story that he told no one. Not the debrief officer, not the doctors who cleaned his wound, not the chaplain who stopped by the recovery room with a soft voice and a practiced expression of concern. Danny Reeves sat through every question and gave every answer and said exactly what he was supposed to say. Then, 2 hours after his debrief concluded, he drove to a gas station 3 miles from the base, parked his car at the far end of the lot, walked to the payphone mounted on the exterior wall, and dialed a number he had memorized and never written down. The call lasted 40 seconds. He drove home afterward and did not sleep. Marcus Holt survived surgery. The attending surgeon, a compact and serious man named Dr. Leonard Price, came out of the operating room at 9 in the morning with his gloves already removed and delivered the update to the 2 men in military dress waiting in the hallway with the kind of controlled calm that was its own form of urgency. Holt was stable. The rounds had been extracted. The lung was repaired. He would need weeks of recovery, possibly more. He was being moved to the ICU, where he would remain under monitoring until his condition allowed otherwise. The 2 men in military dress nodded, asked 2 questions, and made a phone call of their own. Within the hour, a plainclothes federal agent named Gordon Ellery arrived at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. He carried credentials that opened doors without conversation. He spoke briefly with the hospital administrator, reviewed the ICU wing layout, and arranged for a security protocol that was, on paper, routine for patients of Holt's classification level. 2 uniformed personnel posted at the corridor entrance, a restricted visitor log, clearance requirements for anyone entering the wing beyond standard hospital staff. It looked thorough. It was thorough. What Gordon Ellery did next was something that looked, on the surface, like thoroughness as well. He visited Marcus Holt's bedside while the man was still sedated. He reviewed the personal effects catalog during intake. He signed several forms. And then, quietly, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to doing things without being watched, he removed a folded piece of paper from the sealed bag containing the contents of Holt's left boot and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He did not log the removal. The intake nurse at the bedside was adjusting a monitor and had her back turned for the 7 seconds it took. But the hallway was not entirely empty. Claudette Reyes was 46 years old and had been the head nurse of the Walter Reed ICU for 11 years. She had come up through trauma nursing the hard way, through understaffed hospitals and overloaded emergency wards and 2 years abroad in conditions that she rarely discussed and never described in detail. She had the kind of eyes that processed information before the rest of her face caught up. A colleague had once told her, half joking, that she could diagnose a room the way other people read a sentence. Fast, completely, without appearing to try. She had clocked in at 6 that morning, Same as always. She had done her rounds, reviewed her charts, spoken briefly with the night staff handing over, and was walking the corridor outside Holt's room when Gordon Ellery came out. She noted him. Not dramatically. Not with any visible reaction. The way you note a detail that doesn't match the rest of the picture. The way a wrong number on a chart catches your eye before you understand why. A federal agent removing something from a patient's personal effects without logging it. She filed it, kept moving, smiled at the orderly at the end of the hall. But she filed it. Marcus Holt lay in his bed with machines measuring every function his body was performing, and doing a competent job of keeping him performing them. His face, even in the smooth blankness of heavy sedation, carried the weathered quality of a man who had spent most of his adult life outdoors in difficult conditions. There were scars on his hands that were older than some of the nursing staff. A faded mark along his jaw from something that had happened long before Sonora. He had no family listed as emergency contacts. The line on the form was blank. Claudette stood at his bedside during her mid-morning rounds and checked his vitals with the same attention she gave every patient. His numbers were acceptable, improving, slightly. She adjusted his blanket without thinking about it, the way you do when the action comes from somewhere older than habit. She was almost out of the room when she noticed it. His left boot was still with his effects, sealed in the bag on the shelf below the bedside table. Standard protocol. And the bag was sealed. Gordon Ellery had resealed it after removing the paper. He had done it well. But Claudette had watched that bag be sealed during intake. She had been in the corridor. She had a specific and detailed memory for the tape alignment on sealed patient effect bags, because it was the kind of thing that, in her line of work, in the years before this line of work, had mattered enough to notice. The tape alignment was different. She did not touch the bag. She did not change her expression. She finished her chart notation, replaced the clipboard, and walked out of the room at the same pace she had entered it. In the corridor, heading toward the nurse's station, she passed Gordon Ellery, going the other direction. He gave her the polite, distracted nod of a man who had already assessed her as background. She returned it with the automatic courtesy of a woman who had spent years ensuring that men like him assessed her exactly that way. She had a number she had not dialed in 6 years. She was not yet sure she would need to dial it. But she spent the rest of her shift certain of 2 things. The first was that Marcus Holt had not been brought down by enemy fire in any straightforward sense. The geometry of 3 rounds grouped the way his were, in the position he had apparently been in according to the field report she had, quietly, read over a colleague's shoulder during morning briefing. That geometry described something other than a firefight. The second was that the man responsible for removing evidence from a wounded federal operative's personal effects was still inside this hospital, wearing credentials that gave him access to every floor. And she was the only person in the building who knew both of those things at the same time. She finished her shift. She went home. She sat at her kitchen table for a while in the dark without turning on the lights. Then she went to bed, because the morning shift started at 6, and she had never once been late. The temp agency was called Capital Med Staff, and it placed support personnel into hospitals across the greater Washington area on a rolling basis: orderlies, administrative aides, transport staff, lab couriers, the unglamorous infrastructure of institutions that ran 24 hours a day and could never quite keep enough people on payroll. The agency ran background checks. It verified credentials. It maintained, by all visible measures, a professional operation. The man who submitted his application under the name Paul Greer had a background check that cleared without a flag. This was because the identity of Paul Greer had been constructed over a period of several months by people who were very good at constructing identities, and the background check that cleared was attached to a history that was accurate in every verifiable detail and fabricated in every detail that mattered. Paul Greer, as far as any database was concerned, was a 41-year-old from Roanoke, Virginia, with 8 years of hospital support experience, a clean driving record, no criminal history, and a reference letter from a facility in Richmond that was real and would, if called, confirm his employment, because the contact listed was a real person who had been paid a specific sum to confirm it. He arrived for his first overnight shift on a Tuesday. He wore the pale green scrubs of a hospital orderly. He wore comfortable shoes. He had the kind of face that was easy to look past. Not ugly, not distinctive, not remarkable in any direction. Medium height, medium build, brown hair kept short, the sort of features that a witness, asked to describe later, would struggle to assemble into a coherent picture. He knew this about himself. He had known it for a long time. He considered it a professional quality. His handler had briefed him in a parking garage in Arlington 3 days before placement. The briefing was short. There was a patient in the ICU at Walter Reed named Marcus Holt. Holt was scheduled to testify before a federal grand jury in 32 days. The testimony he was prepared to give would damage specific financial and operational arrangements that certain people had spent considerable money constructing. Those people wanted Holt's testimony to become impossible to deliver. There was a federal grand jury date. There was a window. There was a method. The method was not a firearm. A firearm in an ICU was noise. It was response. It was witnesses and footage, and a body that clearly said one thing. The method was pharmaceutical. A precise adjustment to an intravenous line. Something that the monitors would register as a complication. A cascade event. The kind of thing that happened to critically injured patients in intensive care units and was, while tragic, not unheard of, not suspicious, not, in the ordinary course of things, investigated beyond the standard internal review. Paul Greer knew the pharmacology. He had done this kind of work twice before, in different cities, for different clients. Both times had closed as natural complications. Both times he had been 3 time zones away before the attending physician completed the death report. He was methodical about his preparation. In the 4 days before his first shift, he studied the layout of the ICU wing from publicly available building plans, supplemented by what he had observed during 2 separate visits to the hospital as a civilian, once as a man visiting a friend in an unrelated ward, once as a man asking for directions to the parking structure. He noted the positions of cameras. He noted the shift change times. He noted the geography of the corridors relative to the exits. He also noted Claudette Reyes, though he did not know her name yet. He noticed her the way he noticed everything, functionally, without sentiment. She was the head nurse. She ran her floor with a quiet authority that meant she was present everywhere on it, without appearing to rush. She was the kind of person who would notice discrepancies. He cataloged her as the primary variable in his planning. If there was a risk on this floor, she was it. He did not consider her a serious problem. He had worked in facilities with vigilant senior staff before. Vigilant senior staff followed protocol. They noted what protocols asked them to note. They did not, typically, see what they were not looking for. His first 2 shifts were unremarkable. He mopped floors. He moved linen carts. He emptied bins with the unhurried efficiency of a man who understood that being invisible required effort, and that the effort was in the performance of ordinariness. He learned the rhythms of the floor. He confirmed which rooms had direct sight lines to the nurse's station, and which did not. He identified the quietest window, the stretch between 2:30 and 3:15 in the morning, when the staff was thinnest, and the corridor traffic near zero. He planned for his 3rd shift. What he did not plan for, could not have planned for, because the information was sealed behind federal non-disclosure agreements and a new identity issued under protocols that left no public trace, was Claudette Reyes. Not the nurse she appeared to be. The other one. The one from before the nursing license. The one from before the new name. The one who had spent 3 years reading people in circumstances where being wrong cost lives, and who had developed in that time a kind of perception that did not announce itself, and did not require the person being perceived to do anything overt. Paul Greer moved through his first 2 shifts without doing anything wrong. And Claudette Reyes watched him with eyes that were not watching. She was reviewing charts at the nurse's station when he passed on his first night. She did not look up, but she registered the way he walked, not the gait itself, but the relationship between his gait and his surroundings, the way he took in the camera positions without appearing to look at them, the way his hands, wrapped around the mop handle, were relaxed in the manner of a person accustomed to using their hands with precision in high-stress situations. The calluses were on the wrong part of the palm for someone who mopped floors for a living. She knew that kind of hands. She had shaken hands that felt like that, in another country, in another life. She did not react. She let him finish his shift. On his second night, she watched him more carefully, while appearing not to watch him at all. She mapped his patterns. She noted which rooms he lingered near, and which he passed through quickly. She noted that he made 3 slow passes by room 14, where Marcus Holt was recovering, over the course of one shift. Each pass was timed differently. Each was covered by a legitimate task: a bin to empty, a floor section to mop, a linen cart moving in that direction anyway. 3 passes in one shift. The average orderly passed any given room twice on a full overnight rotation. She went home after her second shift of watching him and sat at her kitchen table again, and this time she did not sit long. She dialed the number. It rang twice. The man who answered did not say hello. He never said hello. He said, "How bad?" Claudette said, "ICU tonight, maybe tomorrow night. He has not moved yet." The man said, "The patient?" She said, "Yes." The man said 4 words that were a set of instructions, and then the line went quiet, and Claudette put down the phone and looked at the wall for a moment. She had known, when she made that call 6 years ago the first time, a different situation, a different facility, a different city, that making it meant the man on the other end of it would add her to a category of people who were useful, and therefore could be asked to remain useful. She had understood the exchange. She had made it with open eyes. She did not regret it. She was not sure she had the right to regret the decisions that had kept her alive and allowed her to be standing in this kitchen, at this hour, instead of the alternatives. She went back to the hospital. She had a patient to move. The logistics of relocating Marcus Holt were simpler than they might have appeared, because Claudette had spent 11 years learning the architecture of this place in the way that someone learns a language, not just the words but the grammar, the idiom, the way the sentences fit together in the dark when no one official was listening. She knew which equipment transfers could be logged as routine without generating a second look. She knew the timing of the overnight supervisor's rounds to the minute. She knew which of her staff asked questions and which executed instructions and which simply moved when she said move. At 12 minutes past midnight, Marcus Holt was transferred from room 14 to a room 2 doors down, retagged under a system identifier that would not resolve correctly in any casual scan of the patient database. The man placed in room 14 in his absence was a 62-year-old named Gerald Watkins, recovering from routine orthopedic surgery, sleeping through the night on a sedation schedule that made him deeply and peacefully unaware of anything. Gerald Watkins' paperwork, as it appeared in the database, listed him under a placeholder notation that Claudette had used before for administrative staging. If anyone looked closely, it would resolve. But looking closely was not what happened at 2:30 in the morning in an ICU corridor. She left the floor at 12:45. She returned to the nurse's station. She completed her documentation. She made a cup of tea she did not drink. And she waited. Paul Greer arrived for his shift at 11. He moved through his first hour, exactly as he had moved through the previous 2 nights. Unremarkable, invisible, the living performance of a man who belonged there. Claudette watched the monitors. She watched the corridor. She kept her face the way she always kept her face. Attentive, calm, the expression of a woman for whom this was simply what Tuesday night looked like. At 2:47 in the morning, Paul Greer entered room 14. He was inside for 4 minutes and 8 seconds. He came out with the same face he had gone in with. He returned the cart to the supply area. He completed the rest of his shift. He clocked out at 6 in the morning, nodded to the day staff arriving, and walked to the parking structure. He believed he had done what he came to do. Gerald Watkins woke up at 7:15 and asked for breakfast. His IV drip had been adjusted. The dosage introduced was real, and in a critically injured patient with compromised organ function, it would have done exactly what it was designed to do. In a 62-year-old recovering from knee surgery, with no prior complications, and no vulnerability to exploit, it did nothing except slightly elevate his resting heart rate for approximately 90 minutes, which the monitors noted, and which the morning nurse flagged as a minor anomaly before his vitals returned to baseline. Gerald Watkins ate his breakfast without knowing any of this. He would never know any of this. In room 16, 2 doors down, Marcus Holt was breathing, slowly improving. His numbers, that morning, were the best they had been since the helicopter brought him in. Claudette stood at his bedside during morning rounds and checked his chart and replaced it without expression. She was already thinking about the parking structure. Gordon Ellery had a hotel room 9 minutes from the hospital. He had maintained the room for the 6 days since Marcus Holt's admission. He had justified its cost under a budget line that described his assignment as patient protection coordination, which was accurate in the same way that a map of a city is accurate. It showed the roads without showing what moved through them at night. The paper he had removed from Holt's boot was in a sealed envelope in the room's room safe. He had not forwarded it. He had not destroyed it. He was waiting for a phone call that would tell him which of those two things to do next. And the phone call had not yet come. And so the envelope sat in the safe, and Gordon Ellery continued to show up at Walter Reed each morning, with his credentials and his distracted nod, and his practiced performance of a man doing his job. He was 44 years old. He had been with the Federal Service for 16 years. He had spent the last 3 of those years doing things that the other 16 years had not been designed to accommodate, for people whose names he kept in a separate compartment of his mind, that he tried not to open during working hours. He told himself, when he opened it, that the things he did for those people were a kind of parallel service, a supplementary arrangement, nothing that directly harmed anyone who did not, in some larger accounting, have it coming. He had been telling himself this long enough that the story had worn smooth with use. He no longer examined the edges. He arrived at the hospital on Wednesday morning, same as every morning, and was 20 feet from the elevator when his phone rang with a number that meant his handler was calling, which only happened when something had changed. He answered. The voice on the other end was steady and brief. It said, the package was not delivered. Gordon Ellery did not stop walking. He did not change his expression. He pressed the elevator button and waited. He said, confirmed. The voice said, confirmed. We do not know why. We are looking at the floor records. Gordon Ellery rode the elevator up. He stepped off on the ICU floor. He walked to the corridor and checked the log at the entrance, the same way he did every morning, and noted the same things he always noted: visitor names, times, staff rotations. He noted something else this time. The patient log showed a documentation anomaly from the previous night, a room transfer notation that, when he looked at the timestamps, did not align with any scheduled procedure he was aware of. He stood very still. Then he looked up and down the corridor with the kind of careful attention he had not deployed in a while, and at the far end of the hall, Claudette Reyes was walking toward him with a clipboard and a pace that said she was going somewhere specific. She glanced at him. Just once. The glance was brief enough to be nothing, but in it, in the 1 second of direct eye contact before she looked back at her clipboard, Gordon Ellery felt something shift in his understanding of the last 6 days. He had assessed her as background. He had been wrong. He moved, not toward her, toward the elevator, toward his car, toward the hotel and the room safe, and a set of decisions that were coming at him much faster now than they had been 60 seconds ago. He walked with the controlled speed of a man who was not running. He was very good at not appearing to run. What he did not know was that the call Claudette had made 2 nights ago had set in motion a process that moved faster than hotel room safes. The man she had called was named Neil Carver. He was 51, and he ran a unit inside the Drug Enforcement Administration that was technically a liaison office, and actually something considerably less bureaucratic. He had received Claudette's call, and made 3 calls of his own within the following hour. Those calls went to people who knew how to look at things that were happening quietly inside institutions that were supposed to be looking outward. Within 48 hours of Claudette's call, Neil Carver's people had pulled Gordon Ellery's financial records through a channel that required a judge's signature at midnight, and got it because the judge in question had worked with Neil Carver before and trusted the urgency in his voice. The records were not subtle. They were not, in fact, the records of a man being careful. They were the records of a man who had been doing this long enough to feel secure. Gordon Ellery was 2 blocks from the hospital when the car pulled alongside him. It was a dark sedan, completely ordinary. The window came down, and a man in the passenger seat said his name once. Gordon Ellery stopped. He was smart enough to know what stopping meant and what the alternative was. He was also, beneath everything, tired in a way that the last 3 years had been building and that had been looking, on some level, for a place to land. He got in the car. The hotel room safe was opened an hour later by two agents with a warrant. The envelope was logged, photographed, and sent directly to the federal prosecutor's office handling the grand jury proceedings. It contained a dead drop cipher, a series of coordinates and numerical sequences that, decoded, described the location and timing of a second covert operation that Marcus Holt had been running parallel to his official assignments. An operation that, if the coordinates were accurate, pointed to a supply chain that moved through 3 countries and ended at a financial structure with names attached to it that the grand jury proceedings had not yet reached. The prosecutor spent 2 hours with it. Then she called Neil Carver and said 4 words. Neil Carver said, "I know." "How long?" She said, "A week, maybe less." Paul Greer was taken at Washington Dulles International Airport at 6:43 in the morning. He was at the gate for a flight to Miami. He had a carry-on bag, a boarding pass, and a face that was so effectively unremarkable that the 2 agents walking toward him had memorized a different marker, the particular way he held his right wrist, slightly rotated inward, an old habit from a previous profession, to ensure they had the right person. They had the right person. He did not resist. People like Paul Greer never resisted in public spaces. It was not part of their operating logic. He sat in the quiet room near the baggage claim and answered questions with the kind of measured non-answers that made clear he understood his situation precisely and had no intention of making it worse without receiving something in return. The negotiation that followed was the work of lawyers and prosecutors and would continue for weeks. But the airport was where it began, and the airport was where Paul Greer's name, the real one, not the one on the boarding pass, first entered the federal record. In the ICU at Walter Reed, Marcus Holt opened his eyes properly for the first time in 4 days. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at the room. His mind was working, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed, assembling pieces. The helicopter, the surgical recovery, the machines, the location. He moved his head and found Claudette standing at his bedside. She was reading his chart with the same calm attention she brought to everything. He said, "Water." She poured it without looking up. She adjusted the angle of the cup and held it for him while he drank, and replaced it on the tray with the economy of someone who had done this 10,000 times and kept reading the chart. He watched her for a moment. He said, "The paper." She looked up then, just briefly. She said, "Handled." She replaced the chart, made a small adjustment to the blanket near his left arm, and walked out of the room. She did not look back. Marcus Holt testified before the federal grand jury on a Thursday morning, 26 days after the helicopter had brought him in. He arrived in a wheelchair. His physicians had recommended against it, and he had rejected the recommendation with a single sentence, and was escorted by 2 federal marshals and a quiet, serious attorney who had spent the previous 12 days preparing him for a process that was, by that point, somewhat more straightforward than it might have been. The cipher had done much of the work. Gordon Ellery's financial records had done more. Holt's testimony ran 4 days. He was precise and detailed, and did not embellish and did not minimize. He had the manner of someone who had spent a career making accurate reports under difficult conditions and saw no reason to change the standard. The prosecutor noted, afterward, that he was the clearest witness she had examined in 14 years of federal practice. Danny Reeves testified on the second day. He had been in protective custody since the night of the payphone call, housed in a nondescript location, and kept company by 2 federal agents who played cards with him in the evenings and told him very little about what was happening. He testified about what he had seen on the ground in Sonora, not the official version, the one he had recited at the debrief, but the one he had been carrying since the night he drove to the gas station and stood at the payphone with the receiver in his hand and made the calculation that changed the rest of his life. The indictments that followed covered 2 countries and named 11 individuals in the network that had arranged the Sonora operation. 4 of those individuals were American citizens. 1 held a position in a federal agency. The financial structure that the cipher's coordinates described was dismantled over the following months through a combination of asset seizure and international cooperation that the news reported in general terms, and the specifics of which remained classified. Paul Greer, whose real name entered the record during the proceedings, accepted a plea arrangement that reduced his exposure in exchange for the names of 3 other clients and the operational details of 2 previous contracts. The arrangements he had been a part of were no longer, as a result, confined to the realm of the perfectly unresolved. Gordon Ellery cooperated fully. He was, in the end, useful. The things he knew covered a wider geography than anyone had initially estimated, and the prosecutors were willing to reflect that usefulness in their approach to his case. He did not go to prison. He went somewhere else, under different conditions, which was its own kind of sentence. Marcus Holt was discharged from Walter Reed on a Tuesday morning, 51 days after admission. He walked out under his own power. He had, by the time of discharge, recovered lung function that his surgical team had not, in the first 48 hours, been entirely confident he would recover. He did not make a statement to the press. There was no ceremony. There was a car waiting in the lower bay, and he got into it. Before he left the floor, he stopped at the nurse's station. Claudette was at the desk, reviewing the day's chart rotation. She looked up when he stopped. He stood for a moment with nothing in his hands. He said, "I want to say something." She said, "You already did." He had not, actually. He had said 2 words to her in the weeks of his recovery. Water, the first morning, and thank you, a week later, which she had received with the brief nod of someone accepting a piece of information rather than a compliment. But she meant something else, and he understood it, and he nodded once and walked to the elevator. The car took him somewhere that the file listed only as a secure transitional residence, which was a phrase that covered a range of realities, and his fell on the more comfortable end of that range. What no one in the federal proceedings knew, what was not in any file, not in any testimony, not in any record that the prosecutors reviewed, was the particular sequence that had made the difference. The patient room transfer, the decision made in the small hours of a Wednesday morning by a woman who saw what she was not supposed to see and acted without asking anyone's permission and without leaving a trace that anyone was looking for. Neil Carver knew. He was the only one outside the hospital who did, and he filed nothing about it, because filing it meant explaining the source, and explaining the source meant opening a file on Claudette Reyes that Claudette Reyes had very specifically and deliberately arranged would never exist. She had called in the favor. The favor came back as invisibility. She had known it would. She had built her life, in the years after the other life, on the understanding that the most valuable thing she could possess was the ability to matter in a situation without appearing in its record. She had that. It cost something she did not name out loud, but she had it. She put in a transfer request 2 weeks after Holt's discharge. A county hospital in rural Virginia, smaller, quieter, the kind of place where the administration did not have federal agents in the corridors, and the most complicated nights involved car accidents on isolated roads, and the particular medical emergencies that came from a community aging faster than its healthcare resources could accommodate. The transfer was approved the same afternoon she submitted it. No review board, no counteroffer. The hospital administration signed it with a promptness that suggested someone had called ahead, which someone had, though the call was not logged and the administrator who took it would not have been able to say, afterward, exactly what had been said or by whom. She told her staff she was moving on. She said it at the end of a regular shift, briefly, without ceremony, in the way she did most things. Some of them hugged her. One of them cried, which Claudette acknowledged with a hand on the arm and a few quiet words. She took her personal items from her locker, which were few. She left nothing behind that anyone would notice the absence of. She drove to Virginia on a Sunday. The new hospital was smaller in every dimension. Fewer beds, fewer staff, a different pace, a different architecture, a different quality of silence in the corridors at 3 in the morning. She spent her first week learning it the way she learned every place she worked. Systematically, completely, without appearing to study it. By the end of the week, she knew the sounds the equipment made, and what each sound meant, and what it meant when a sound was absent. She knew which of her nurses worked fastest under pressure, and which needed a moment to settle before they could operate clearly. She knew the layout of every room, and the position of every camera, and the timing of every routine that shaped the flow of each shift. She knew these things because knowing them was how she did her job. That was the truth of it. The other things, the reading of people, the recognition of what did not belong, the capacity to act without escalating. Those were also part of doing her job. They had always been part of it, even before the job was nursing. On her second Friday, a man came through the emergency bay on a gurney. He had been in a car accident, according to the paramedics, on a rural road 12 miles out. The injuries were consistent with that account. The vehicle had been confirmed. The other driver was already at the hospital, treated and released. Everything about the situation was consistent with exactly what it said it was. Claudette was passing through the ER bay when the gurney came through. She was not the admitting nurse. She had no clinical reason to be looking at the man on the gurney. She looked anyway. He was wearing the clothes of a man who had been in a car accident. He had the right injuries in approximately the right places. He answered the intake nurse's questions with the focused brevity of a man in pain, but he held himself the wrong way. Not dramatically, not in any single obvious manner. In the aggregate, the specific relationship between his posture and his surroundings, the way his eyes moved across the room while his face held the expression of a man focused only on the ceiling, the particular economy of his stillness. Claudette had seen it twice in her life before she could name it, and many times after. She kept walking. She did not pause. She did not look back at the gurney or the intake nurse or any of the equipment around it. But she was already thinking. The supply closet on this floor was different from the one at Walter Reed. Smaller, different shelf layout, the light switch on the right instead of the left. But it served the same purpose, and she had located it on her first day, the way she located everything, because knowing where it was meant, she would not have to think about it when thinking was not what the moment required. She had 90 seconds. She had done it in less. The number she would dial was the same number she had always dialed, because some things in her life changed, and some things did not, and Neil Carver was one of the things that did not, and that was a comfort of a very specific and unsentimental kind. She reached the closet door. She opened it. She stepped inside. She had learned, across a long career of making impossible decisions in very short windows, that the question was never whether the cost was worth it. The cost was always there. It was always real. The question was only whether you were the kind of person who paid it, or the kind of person who looked away. She had answered that question a long time ago, in a different country, in a different life, under circumstances that were sealed behind enough paperwork to fill a room. She picked up her phone. She was already sure. She dialed.